down to focus on a narrow area here, how much hour we can do in the 45 minutes. Just to set expectations, I want to already say that I probably will not be able to touch on coverage at all. So some of the later parts of the talk, I may not even get to it. So just to be sure, usually this takes a lot more time than I can do in 45 minutes. I'll try to get to as much as I can, but just want to make that clear. I may not get to that point. So let's get started. Let's get to the chase. What are we trying to do? I'm a huge fan of unit testing, and one of the reasons I like unit testing is that it gives a rapid feedback. We can get to know very quickly when we modify the code whether the code is fulfilling the expectations we have already set in the code. And so oftentimes when you hear about unit testing, programmers say, we really want to do unit testing, but it's really hard to do it on JavaScript. And the result is most of us give up a unit testing JavaScript. So I kind of took it as a challenge, and I said to myself, how would I go about unit testing JavaScript? And I found out that it's really actually not that hard. One thing it requires is probably the one that is a little hard to find, which is called the discipline. But once we have the discipline and a few techniques we kind of gather, we should be able to do it. And I think that's kind of the most important thing to take away is unit testing is actually a skill. It's a skill like riding a bicycle, skill like driving a car, and it's something that we have to take the time to practice and learn, and once we do, it gets fairly easy. Now, what makes really JavaScript really hard to test, and let's take a look at what actually makes it hard to test. So I have a little example here, and I need your help to think about testing this for a minute. So it's very simple. You can relate to this fairly quickly. And all I have here is a HTML file, as simple as this. I have a body of code that I'm going to write within that. I've got a little input, which is taking an email, as you can see here. And then you have the name and an ID called email. And I have a little error email span tag where I'm going to display an error. And then I have an input, going to click on a submit button. And when you click on the submit button, I want to validate and see if this email is valid or not before I send it to the server. So for that reason, I have an onChange method. I'm going to event. And within the onChange, I'm calling validate email. And the validate email is essentially accepting the current object. It also accepts the document dot and element by ID error email, which is this span tag. Of course, what's left here is to implement the validate email function. So I'm writing the script for it. And here is the validate email, which is accepting the email and the error input fields. I'm performing a regular expression match. And if the regular expression match failed, I'm going to report an error. And right there, I'm going to say that this is good, no errors. If there was an error, then I'm going to display invalid email address. And then I'm going to set the focus back on the text field that is going to allow you to enter the email address. Are you following me so far? Right? Just a little button, you click on it, it validates, tells you if it's good or bad, sets the content back. How do we unit test this code? That's the right answer I get first time around, right? We don't know how to unit test it. Let's push it a little bit further. What are some of the ways to unit test this code? That's the first thing, right? You need to separate this code from the HTML page. We all know that putting JavaScript in HTML is evil. Have you ever seen JavaScript in HTML page? Absolutely, right? So we kind of know it, but we discard it. So first is to decouple. Once we decouple it, we have a way to start unit testing it. But that's only half the problem, right? If you look at this code is merged with dependency. It requires the DOM object. It needs to go talk to the DOM object, and there's so much dependency, so it feels intimidating. But we're going to take it as a challenge, and we're going to write this entire code test-driven, writing test before we write a single line of code. Does it sound right? Sound good? We can do it? All right. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's discard this code away. We can come back to this later if you want to. And what I'm going to do is to start with a few things we're going to work on together here. First of all, I'm going to create a directory here called source. I'm going to create a directory called test. I'm going to write some test and I'm going to write some code. So let's create a file here under source. and I'm going to call it as validate.js. Under the test directory, I'm going to say validate test.js. So these two files are empty, as you know. I'm just creating them. So here is the validate.js, which is empty, doesn't have anything in it. And here is the validate test, which is also empty, as you can see here. So we're going to write a test. So where do we start? Well, we need a testing tool to begin with. One of the tools I used in the past is a tool called JS Unit, perfectly a good tool. But one of the things you do when you start using tools like JS Unit is you have to write an HTML file which refers to the script and refers to the test file. And I've, over the years, become extremely lazy. Some people want to call it efficient, but I'm really lazy. And I really don't want to do any stuff that I don't have to do. And so why should I bother creating a dummy HTML file with a few markers in it if I can do without it? And there's another big, important requirement I have for running automated unit testing. If you cannot run the test from command line, your approach is dead to me. Why is that such a hard requirement? Why do I care to run this from command prompt? Yes, automation, but push it a little further. Thank you, Scott. It's continuous integration, right? So you want continuous integration. If you cannot run it from the command line, it's hard to continuously integrate it. And every time somebody touches a piece of code, modifies it, checks it in, you want an automated build to continuously integrate it and tell you right away that the code works or not. And if you have a set of automated tests that are run or triggered manually, then people quit running it, and 4 or 5 weeks later, somebody gets a bright idea to run it once, and they run it and they look at this and say, oh my God, there's so many errors, keep quiet. Let's not run this again, right? And eventually, it gives an illusion of test being there, which is worse than not having test cases. So that's one of the most important things. So I'm going to say, I want to run these from the command prompt. But then you say, hang on a second, JavaScript has two problems, right? One is the problem we create. We could mess up and make mistakes in it. What's the other problem? That's right, the browsers mess up. And if you're running this from a command prompt, how do you get that feedback? So what I would like is a best of both worlds. And there is such a tool to do this. It's called JS Test Drive. And this tool is amazingly good. It's got to be, because it's from Google, right? So JS Test Drive, here's how it works. It's a little server. I know it's a scary word to use. Just an application that runs. You run it locally on your machine. And what you do is you write from the command prompt, tell him to run a test. The test is pushed on to JS Test Drive. And JS Test Drive will then have browsers connect to it. What kind of browsers can you connect to it? You can connect Firefox. You can connect Chrome. You can connect Safari. You can connect different browsers to it. You can even connect your mobile device browsers by entering the URL, so you can see how the code behaves on a mobile device also if you just point to that URL. So the way this works is your test runs from the command prompt, pushes it to the server then pushes it to the browsers. The code runs within the browser, but what happens to this code, whether it runs and succeeds, is captured back by the server and reported back on the command prompt. Make sense? So let's start doing this. But where do we start? You don't write 20 lines of code and then figure out the tool is not even set up on your machine. So we use something called a canary test. A canary test is a kind of an initial stupid test you write just to see if things work properly. If a canary test fails, you can go to somebody and say, help me here, what's going on? And they don't need to know anything about what you are trying to do because it's so small and general, right? This comes from the term canary in a coal mine, where the miners take a little bird canary into the mine, and the canary keeps singing all day. And if it smells a fume, the canary dies. This is an early warning sign for the miners. This is good for the miners, not for the bird. And this immediately gives a feedback to say, something is wrong, right? So we can start with a canary test. So notice what I'm going to do here. In the validate test, I'm going to go ahead and create a test case. And in the test case itself, I'm going to define what this test case is. And we'll call this as validate test. And then I'm going to create a set of properties. This is just JavaScript we're writing, correct? And the set of properties, the first one is test canary. And what is this test canary going to hold? It is just going to hold a first unit test, which is a dummy test, function. And all that I'm going to do here is assert true, and I'm going to specify true. How many of you have used JUnit before? Well, you already know the syntax now, right? That's very similar to what you're using here. Same set of methods, assert true, assert equals, and so on, right? So you have basically assert true, and I'm ready to run this. How do I run this little test? If this test passes, then we know our setup is correct, right? So I've written myself a little example here to run this. I have a run server, and run server is just starting a JS test driver and points to where the jar file is located, and it specifies a port. There is also a configuration file I would really need here. And if you look at the config file, this is just a YAML file. That's all it is. All this is on my website. You don't have to write this down. You can just download and play with it. And this is simply telling you that go ahead and load the source code from the SRC directory and the test code from the JS directory. You saw me create those two directories a few minutes ago, right? So you're pointed to these two different directories. And now what's going to happen? I'm going to fire up the server. And server is going to start. I'm going to start it in a separate command prompt. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and increase the font just a few minutes. So I'm going to run the server at this point. So run server. And when I hit the return, what happens? Nothing happens. That's good. That's a Unix model. If everything is good, you just keep quiet, right? So that means everything is fine. He's happy with it. Now I need to start a browser. And like I said, I want to do this from the command prompt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open -F Firefox, and I'm going to point into the HTTP local host, and the port number I defined, if you recollect, was 8003, and capture is the URL that I'm going to ask him to go down to. So this is basically going to, is it -A? My brain is locking up on me. So I'm asking to launch it, there we go. So -A, that's starting up. If you're not on a Unix box, you can use in the command line a start command rather than the open command, and it should really start whatever application you are telling it to start. So that browser is captured. If you're doing this manually, you could, of course, go to localhost 8003, and you'll see a little button that you can click on, or a link to go to the capture page. So we've captured that particular browser. So what am I going to do next? My next effort is to run the server. So I'm going to kind of minimize this a little bit so you don't have to see it. It's going to be quiet for most part. So I'll just kind of move it away. I also minimize the browser. Remember, the browser is still running. And now I need to run my test. So I wrote myself a little script called run test. It's again running the test driver, but it's telling him to use the configuration file that I wrote, and it tells to run all the tests. That's all, right? Again, don't worry about the details of the script to run. You will eventually figure it out. So run test is what I'm running. And notice when I say run test, it tells us today is our lucky day. It ran a test, and it tells us the test really passed. And notice it says the test ran on Firefox. Make sense? So it ran that little silly test I wrote, and it's reporting back saying one test ran, and 0 failures were there. Happy? Let's do one more thing. Let's start Firefox real quick. So Safari real quick. And I could have used the -A comment also, but just to show you. So I go to http://localhost 8003. That's the link I was talking about, capture. Now Safari has been captured. Now what do? Run the test one more time. Notice it reports 2 tests has executed. Take this as a cue. When your boss walks in, start more browsers. You get good pat on the back. You're running a lot of tests. Good job, right? So as you can see, the test is running in 2 browsers. Go ahead, please. Moving on. So, of course it does. Yes. He doesn't believe me. It does. It certainly does. So you can start as many browsers as you want. It's even better than that. You could actually start multiple tabs in the same browser, because sometimes a script may run fine in one and may not run fine in another window, and you can come back and test for those as well. So far, so good? Excellent. All right. So what do? Now I have to start writing real tests. Oh, wait a minute, but before I do that, I have one problem here. Like I said, I'm a lazy guy, and now I have to write the code, switch over to the command prompt, and run a script. And that doesn't seem like agile, right? Why should I waste my time doing that? That's kind of boring. So let's make ourselves even more lazier. I'm going to run a little script. There is a little Ruby plugin, by the way. And I'm going to run the little plugin, and that's running here on this window. I'm going to kind of make this a little big and leave it here. So let's just kind of leave it here. So I'm going to leave it on the side, and I go back here to the test, and I hit the save button, and you will notice it's running. And I know it's a little hard for people in the back to see this, but people in the front can confirm. Do you see a little green stuff here? Yep. So it really runs the test. If you flip over here, you'll be able to see. That's more visible, isn't it? I kind of set my windows with a little transparency when I work, so I kind of can squint my eyes and see what's behind it. So I'll be, kind of listening to music, write some code, hit the save button, and it tells you whether the test is still passing. You don't have to move a muzzle to run your test, right? So please, you have my permission. Be lazy. Get lazy. And what happens when you get so lazy? Productivity goes through the roof, right? Then you can focus on doing real work rather than simply switching windows, right? So that's the beauty of this. And just to prove that this is actually working, let's switch over here and change this to a false and hit the, hit the save key. You can see that it's running. Again, people in the front can probably confirm, but it turned red. Trust me, that's red color, okay? So as a result, you can kind of get a very rapid feedback. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of leave it here, and then we can come back and take a look at it as we are writing the code and then playing with it. So far, so good? So we have kind of automated some of these steps. Now that it's running from the main prompt, you can check this into your continuous integration server, configure it depending on what you're using, whether you're using cruise control, Jetson, Hudson, whatever that is, Jensen. You can configure whatever that may make sense, and then have that run for you regularly. Okay, now back to the problem we started with. What do I want to do? I want to get to the real test. Test email is valid. That's my next test I want to write. And what do I write in this test? It's a function I'm going to write. And I'm going to simply say here, I want to validate a particular email address. That's what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to say, let me lower the font a little bit here for me. So I'm going to say here, assert. So let's say, where do I start? Validate email, right? That's a function I want to call. And the validate email is going to take two parameters, right? It's going to take the email, and then it's going to take the error, little thing for the error, the span tag that we had. So I'm going to call this. How do I know this has succeeded? So I'm going to say assert equals, and I'm going to say empty, right? I don't want any result in here, so that's empty, right? And then on what? Error dot inner HTML. So I'm going to kind of keep it very close to the code that you saw as I'm driving the design of this. Now, of course, will this test pass or will this test fail? Why would it fail? Because I don't even have the function yet, right? So this will fail really miserably. So let's go ahead and run it, and just to be sure that I don't have anything under my sleeves, the test is running and it failed, as you can see. The test is failing, right? So right in the corner of the window, you can see it, that it's failing. Fair enough. What's the next thing I'm going to do? So the next thing I'm going to do here is to implement the validate email function. So let's go to the validate.js. The method name equals function. It takes two things, email and error. So I need your help to implement this function. What should I do in here? Say that again? Nope, too much.
The same thing that you have there.
Too much. Repeat the question you said? No, too much. No, too much. Nothing. Do nothing. Right? That's test driven, right? Don't do any real work until you're forced to do it. Remember, we are lazy people, remember? So you say, I don't have to do anything. Test is passing. Why write more code? Because all that the code said was, check to make sure the error.innerHTML is empty. Well, that's good enough, right? No need to write any more code here. Of course it failed because I haven't set up what this email is. So var email equals, and let me set this to my own email address. So right there is my email address. And what do I want to set the error to be? Var error is going to be inner HTML. Actually, this is going to be email value, right? Or is it text? So let's leave that for now. So I'm going to say error, and the error is going to be inner HTML, and that is going to be just an empty string. So we're going to send that in and ask him to execute, and our test is passing. So we didn't have to write any code. That's one of the reasons I love test-driven development. You don't have to do real work. Until, you know, why you say, why would you do that? Because the first few tests really are useful to develop the interface of your function. And once you let these initial few functions develop the interface, then you close in on the implementation. There's no reason to rush to the implementation until you figured out what it should do. Why should you focus so much on how it should do it? So from the object-oriented principle, it actually makes sense to write a few tests that lets you kind of grow and build the interface of functions and then come in. So there's a good reason for being, you know, lazy in that regard. Okay, that's cool, that's working, that test is passing. Now I'm ready for the next test. So test email has no, what do you call the last three things, the .com and stuff like that? All right, so function, you can figure out what the TLD stands for. And what should I do? Var email equals, and I have to specify an email address here. Well, we could optimize this a little bit while we are here, because I'm going to duplicate that code. That kind of feels really smelly, isn't it? So I'm going to go up here, and in JUnit, what kind of method would help you to kind of group those together? That's correct, setup method. So I'm going to write a setup method, and it's a function I'm writing here. And what does he do? He simply says this dot email equals, and then I can specify here my email address. And similarly, I can say this dot error equals, and then I can set the error to be the inner HTML is empty. So we got those two guys developed. And now I go back down here, and I don't need to define these two guys anymore. So this is going to be this dot email, and this is going to be this dot error. And of course, this has to be this dot email. So I'm just refactoring that a little bit and make sure the test is still running, and it seems to be. And now I go back over here and say, validate email, and I'm going to send this dot email without TLD, right? I'm using kind of cryptic names here because I'm using a very big font, and you should be able to see it. Usually I have a little bit of a better name to these variables. So error, and so what should I do in here? Assert equals, and I'm going to specify whatever it is. I'm just going to say oops again because I don't want a lengthy name here. You won't be able to see it. Again, I would put a fairly descriptive name in reality. So this is going to be this dot error dot inner HTML. Of course, I need this error, this guy here. So let's go define it. So I'm going to simply say this dot, that object equals, and I need to specify something without the TLD, right? So we'll write my email address and remove that part. So now we need to write the code to make that work. Now when I run the test, obviously you can see the test actually failed because our code was the brilliant do nothing code, right? So now we're at a moment where we are forced to do real work. So if you do decide to stay on the job, you got to write real code now, right? So we have to implement something. How do I implement it? Again, I would implement the minimum code to make that work, but since we are in a time bind here, I won't put too much effort into it. So what do I do here? Well, we have the email on hand, and I need to really validate, pull in. Oh, making mistakes here. There we go. So I pulled in my email regular expression. As you can see, I can write regular expressions really quickly. And now that I have the regular expression on my hand, I'm going to simply ask him to check it. So if match result is not equal to null, then I need to report an error, right? So what am I going to report as an error? Error.inner HTML, right? And inner HTML equals, did I say oops? All right, thank you. So oops. So let's save that and see what happens. Oh, it's still failing. What did I do wrong? Or is it equal? Always that confusion, right? Yep. So notice the test is passing. That means that it had an incorrect matching. Both the tests are passing, so we are writing another test for it. Let's move on to a couple of more tests before we get to some interesting bottleneck. The next is test email has no domain, and that's going to handle also. So I'm going to skip that part, right, because I already wrote the code for it. But you'll be writing and building these test cases. But I need one more thing. Test email, a valid email, resets the inner error, right? So if I write a test for that, let's go ahead and say function. And what is this function going to do? So first of all, I'm going to ask him to validate an email without the domain. And he's going to tell me that it's oops. Then I'm going to ask him to validate the email with the proper email address. So am I making sense? So I first sent him a bad email address, then I sent him a good email address, and now I want him to tell me that the error flag has been reset. So if I go run this little code, let's see what's going to happen. Save. And you notice that the test is failing. And the reason the test is failing is our code was checking for an error and it said in our HTML, but when the email address is valid, it never cleared it. Again, we kind of slowly only write code when you have a failing test. We don't want to go and start writing code without a failing test, right? So that takes a bit of a discipline to get to that point. So now I'm going to say in this case, else, and I'm going to say, what do I say here? Error.innerHTML equals, and we're going to simply say empty for that. Hit the save button, and we can see that the test is passing. So I got to this point. Now it's time for you to code the rest of the test. That's only fair, right? So the next thing I want you to do is set focus on that field that we have. How do we do that? How do we write a test for it? I'm making sense? If an email address is valid, in fact, I will start the test for you so we can start thinking about it. So the test I want to write over here is test set focus on email after invalid error, right? Are you thinking? So function, what should I do in this test? I need to know that you set the focus on that text box. Say that again? Check the focus is true or not. All right? And by the way, don't worry about being wrong. All right? I'm wrong most of the time, or my wife tells me so. So don't worry about being wrong. So check the focus to see if it's true. But where do I go to check for it? All right, so the error object, but remember the focus is going to be on the email field, not on the error object. But does that work that way? Write a dummy object. That's another suggestion. What kind of dummy object can I write? Something that has a set focus on it, right? That could be an approach we could take. So it's kind of a little confusing here. How do we go about doing this? Now, there's one more problem. There's another comment, please, yes. You should have a method called focus that should return true, but it's not clear what you would do in terms of testing with it, right? There seems to be a little bit of a bottleneck there. Here's another complication, by the way. If you look at, yep, go ahead.
You can check document.active element, which gives you the element which is currently.
So you can go to the document and get the active element, and there's a word that comes to mind. It's called coupling. Notice how we kind of get dragged into the DOM components now, and your JavaScript just becomes heavy. And then you are like, oh my God, I got to deal with the DOM, right? DOM is a scary word, isn't it? So I'm trying to avoid that. So what can I do? Here's another complication, right? Even if you set the focus, you cannot really set the focus like that. You have to call the SetTimer. And what happens if when you call the SetTimer? Remember, our code is not calling setFocus. It's calling SetTimer, which calls the setFocus. You remember that? So we are not even at the setFocus yet. We're at the SetTimer level. But here's the problem with SetTimer. It runs asynchronously. So how do you know it actually executed? So even if we get to all these suggestions you said, to check that, the SetTimer has to run. And I'm in the test. I told him to go call the SetTimer. He did. But there's nothing I can do in my test at this point because the SetTimer hasn't run yet. You feel the pain, right? Because in JavaScript, you cannot create threads. You do asynchronous call. So once your test completes, the SetTimer is called, right? And where do you go verify now? It's too late. That's why, folks, you don't do unit testing on JavaScript. Thanks for coming. Well, what do we do? So here is a way to think about it. I'm going to test, Sunil? I'm going to test Sunil's integrity as a human being. How good is a person? I know Google, he worked for Google, he's got to be good. But I want to assert it, unit test it, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to tell Sunil there's fire in the building. And as a good citizen, what should he do? Immediately tell his neighbors, right? Hey, looks like there's a fire in the building, leave the room. But if I really do this now, the cops are going to come in, I get arrested. This is really messy. So I'm going to mock his neighbors. And you know how complex Scott really is. Do you think he's a person who's mockable that way so easily? But I'm sorry, Scott, that is your mock. Okay? I mean, last time it was not even this. Okay, so that is his mock. So what am I going to do? I'm going to mock away his neighbor. Sunil doesn't know this. I'm saying this is his mock, his neighbor. And I tell Sunil there's fire in the building. And I just go to this mock and ask one question, what is it? Did you receive a message, right? I don't care about the complexity of his neighbor or his charm for that purpose, right? I only worry about if he's received a message. But I'm going to put Sunil through even more difficult test. I'm going to tell him there is one dessert outside on the table. If he's really wise, what does he do? Quietly slip away to get the dessert. He doesn't announce it because there's going to be a riot to go get it, right? So I tell him there's a dessert and I check what? That no message was received. Am I making sense? So your goal is really not about setting the focus at this point. Your goal is to see if your code requested a focus to be set. This was the aha moment for me, by the way. Call me silly, but I did not realize this for a long time. And one day it dawned on me that I was doing this totally wrong. I don't need to really test those dependencies. I need to only focus on the fact that this code is actually invoking these requests. Once I understand it, everything fizzles down to simplicity. So notice, yes, please, go ahead.
But isn't it that we have not written the code and you are assuming that it has to call focus?
No, we know that that's our domain. That's what we're trying to build, right?
You are doing TDD, right?
We are doing TDD. I haven't written the code yet.
So you will be calling focus and you are assuming that we are calling focus, you will test it in the test.
Well, what is TDD? It's a design of the code you're about to write. And we are saying our code is supposed to set focus. How are we going to design it? That's exactly what happened for the past 5 minutes, right?
Before writing test, we know it has to set focus.
Well, you know, well, I'm hoping you got to work knowing what you're going to do work on today, right? That's still part in the game, right?
But we should be testing the API only, isn't it?
Testing what API, though?
The method API,
Which method API?
validate email.
No, this is a unit test. It's not an integration test. Unit test deals with the implementation and the design of the code. It's a white box testing, right? It's not an integration test. You'll be in Selenium level if it's integration testing, right? So you're driving the design of the code at this point, and that's why you're getting into all these details. Otherwise, you would call somebody who's just doing testing and saying, make sure this output in the UI is done. Then you're not even at the JavaScript level, right? So what are we doing here? I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to set the focus. Hey, wait a minute, but what is the set focus? So notice what I'm going to do. I'm going to say set focus equals, and I'm going to mark away the set focus function. Thank you. And if I'm going to mark away the set focus function, oh my God, what marking framework am I going to use? It's called JavaScript. Good answer. That is the beauty, right? JavaScript is so flexible, it can mark things you don't need any framework to use. So I'm going to say set focus equals, I'm going to create a function, and I know what this function is going to take. Some email, right, that it's going to take, or more so the ID. So I'd say email ID. That's what it's going to take. And I'm going to send him an email ID to set the focus on. And what am I going to do here? I'm going to simply say set focus called equals true. And of course, I'm going to start with var set focus called equals false. So I'm going to set this value here, right? So then I come in here, and I ask him to validate an email which is invalid. So as you can see, I'm calling that function. And now all that I do is assert true set focus called. I haven't even gotten to the code yet. Am I making sense so far, what I'm trying to do? I'm just saying I'm going to call this validate function, and that function better has called set focus. Am I making sense? I haven't written that function yet. We haven't written the code yet. But I just marked away this set focus. That's all I did. If I run this, of course, my test should fail, and it did. So now I'm going to go back to the code, and I'm going to say, if this failed, call the set focus. And what am I going to send to him? I'm going to send email.id, which I don't have yet, but don't worry about it right now. And then I'm going to say var set focus equals function. And this is going to take an email ID as a parameter. going to leave this empty. I'm not interested in implementing that function yet because I'm not testing that function at this time. My focus is on the validate email, not the set focus. Am I making sense? So you kind of postponed a decision. So I told you first to be lazy. Now I'm telling you postpone decisions. These are somehow healthy habits to develop, right? So postpone decisions until the most, as much as possible. You don't need to make the decision right now. So set focus is separately. You can set the focus on writing the test for it and the code for it later on. So far so good? Let's see what happens now. So we go run this code. It still failed. What did I do wrong? Does this have an ID in the first place? I don't think it really matters, right? It's not going to use the ID. Does anybody see what the problem is? What was it? In the if block. Did I do that wrong? Ah, you're right. It does help to write the code in the proper place. Right? Absolutely. So go change it. There you go. That shows you that I'm not lying. That's real code there, right? So move it up to the right place and it's working. The test is working. Make sense so far? Now you can continue to write more tests to make sure the ID being sent to you is the ID you expect. We're not going to learn anything new by writing the test in this 30 minutes, right? Am I making sense? So no need to go any further on that. There's still one small problem, by the way. I did something terrible in the test. What did I do wrong? I'll give you a clue. Line number 30. I removed the original set focus and I marked it away. What's the problem? The original function is kind of gone in that sense, right? So if I have another test, what's going to happen to that test? That probably is going to fail or use an inappropriate behavior, right? In other words, one of the principles we have to follow is the tests are independent of each other. What do? It turns out you can do this fairly easily. In JavaScript, you can replace methods at will. You can store methods as well. So what I'm going to do is, in the setup method, I'm going to make a copy of this method. See if this makes sense. So I go to the setup method, and in the setup method, I'm going to say this dot set focus original equals set focus. All right, so I saved it away. Then I can come back here in the test, and I can say set focus equals set focus original. Okay, that's a good attempt, but there's a problem in this code. What is it? If this test fails, what's going to happen? That's right. If the test fails, you're not resetting it. Now you have to put, hang on, you're right. I could put a try and finally block. But that's going to be messy. And I got to repeat this in every place. And a gentleman here had a wonderful suggestion, which is use the tear down method. What a great idea. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So you can write a tear down method, and that way it's taken care in all your tests. So I'm going to simply go back over here and say, I'm going to write a tear down method. And in the tear down method, I'm going to create a function. And within this function, I'm going to simply say, the set focus equals set focus original. And that way, it puts the set focus back after the change. And I don't have to do that stuff repeatedly in all this code. So notice the test is still passing. And now you can add more tests to this. So the moral of the story here really is that you really don't have to worry about the code being called and what effect it has or what it does. All that you have to focus on really is that you are calling the focus function. That's all you're doing. And obviously quite a few people lost focus, so I'll stop here. Thank you.